Music stopped.
Good evening, everyone. And I am Bryant Warren. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Gospel of Justice Ministry of Victory Apostolic Church. I want to welcome all of you to a very special Victory at the Table on the Go edition. Because of the snow and the weather, the church has shut down, so we are broadcasting live from my home office. And tonight we have a very special theme for you. We are focusing on the Black community and the healthcare system. In particular, we're going to discuss the coronavirus and the new vaccine that is rolling out. As you know, there are nearly 500,000 people have lost their lives to the coronavirus this past year. And unfortunately, it has disproportionately impacted Black and brown communities in this country. And tonight, we're going to have some deep conversation, get some information about this particular issue. So as we're having this conversation, we want it to be as interactive as a virtual conversation can be. So we want you to put your questions into the chat. So you can go to Facebook, our Victory Apostolic Church, the Victory Apostolic Church in Matson, Illinois, and you can input your questions and comments there. And if you are enjoying the program, make sure that you let us know by putting in your comments. Or you can go to victoryapostolicchurch.sermon.net and you can post your questions and your comments there. Now tonight, I am really excited because we have two very special guests here. So if we're going to start talking about healthcare in our community, we need to bring in some experts from our community. So we have two doctors, both of them are from the St. Louis, Missouri area. And the first person I want to introduce to you is Dr. Danny Williams. She lives in St. Louis, Missouri, and she is a general practitioner with a focus on family medicine. She has earned her Bachelor of Science degree from Xavier University, which is in New Orleans. She has in New Orleans, and she had a degree in biology. She has a Master of Public Health from Tulane University with a focus on international health and development. And then she has her medical degree from the University of Texas, where she pursued her passion, which is primary care medicine. Dr. Williams is certified in advanced trauma and life support and fundamentals of critical care. Dr. Williams has a special focus on preventive health, but is particularly dedicated to women's health and education. And on top of all of that, she is fluent in Spanish. Dr. Danny, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, Pastor Warren. I'm super excited to be here and to be able to interact with people and to continue to help to educate our community, have this dialogue, which is very necessary.
Absolutely. The next person I want to introduce is no stranger to Victory. She's actually the last speaker I've had here before the shutdown, and she's the first speaker, one of the first speakers we're bringing back afterwards. Dr. Jamica Woody Cooper. She is an accomplished counseling psychologist, educator, entrepreneur, author, and civic leader. Dr. Woody Cooper holds a PhD in educational and counseling psychology from the University of Missouri, Columbia, and is the recipient of a Fulbright Award Fellowship in Global Health. Dr. Woody Cooper was awarded the Salute to Excellence in Healthcare in honor of her dedication to healthcare for African American individuals in the community. She has been featured in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNBC, NBC, ABC News, and USA Today. So you all know why I brought her in here. We're bringing in the hot people. She is a dynamic mental health expert with a unique perspective on the topic of race, urban mental health, and community intervention. Now, Dr. Mika, again, is no stranger to us. She was just here in October, and where she did an excellent presentation on PTSD. not post-traumatic stress disorder, but post-traumatic slave disorder, and discuss how slavery still impacts us today. So thank you again, Dr. Jamica, for being here today. So we're going to get started up. And again, the focus is dealing with the vaccine. And a lot of our people in our community are afraid of getting this vaccine. We're concerned about the coronavirus. And doctors, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm nervous myself. I'm in that community of people who are saying, you know what, I'm going to wait and see. But, you know, Pastor has gotten it. My wife has gotten it. And so I'm hoping to hear some information tonight that is going to make me feel more comfortable and help the rest of the Black community feel more comfortable with this particular vaccine. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to they're known nationally as the Diva Docs, and then we're going to come in back with some questions.
Thanks so much, Pastor Bryant. I think your, what you've expressed about, having fears is something that in general, our community is expressing at this time. But in general, that's rooted in the history of our treatment in the medical system. And so we're going to dive a little bit into that today. But, this coronavirus outbreak has definitely impacted the African-American community, as you kind of alluded to, a lot more heavily than other other groups and we're all aware that since the beginning of this coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan, China in January of 2020, that there have been many wild stories about the origin of the disease, including some theories that were started by none other than our previous president, Donald Trump, QAnon, and some other conspiracy related groups who basically function in kind of creating and spreading fear. And we'll talk about some of these theories and myths, but I think that first we should talk about what we do know about coronavirus or COVID-19. So the first thing is, how did we get the name COVID-19? If you break down the name the CO stands for the corona, VI or VI, stands for the virus itself, and then the 19 was the year in which the virus was discovered. Now, for those of us in the medical community who did our training in the 21st century, learned about coronaviruses, when we learned about it, it was a group of viruses that were benign. They caused, upper respiratory symptoms that were mimicking the cold. And that's basically what we knew it as. Treated, by symptom management, it was harmless and there was nothing to worry about. But then in 2002, there's a sudden outbreak of a coronavirus called Sars or bird flu in China. And during that outbreak, it was something that we had never seen before. That outbreak, we learned that the virus had done something which we had previously thought that was not possible in the medical community, and that was to actually jump species without an intermediary. And so basically that meant that this flu, which had previously been known to only exist in chickens and birds, had been discovered in a human when 2 young children fell deathly ill, and they ended up swabbing the children and finding that they had H5/N1 virus, which was the SARS virus or bird flu at that time. And although the Chinese government was slow to act about this outbreak during that time, and they didn't really report it to the World Health Organization like they were supposed to at the time, once they did get ahead of it and start to treat it, it was brought pretty quickly under control by doing things that we're doing now, wearing masks, aggressive hand washing, treating the symptoms early. And by the end of July 2003, it had been contained and limited to only, to China. This time, when the pandemic of the coronavirus or COVID-19 broke out in Wuhan, China, it really shouldn't have been a surprise to us, because after that first pandemic or epidemic that happened in China in 1997, when the bird flu occurred, there was actually a pandemic task force that was formed in response to this outbreak in China. And a Chinese researcher who was a leading authority at the time actually predicted that southern China would become the epicenter for pandemics because of the close proximity in which people were living to animals. So fast forward to January 2020. The world has started to realize there is an outbreak that's not going to be limited to China. In fact, it's starting to show up in places like Italy and Europe, and then eventually the United States. What do we think would happen in communities where people have been traditionally underserved, and the places where the basic traditional needs, such as accessing healthcare, has already been a difficult problem and our people have been marginalized? Well, to quote Malcolm X, when America catches, or when white America catches the cold, Black America catches pneumonia. And what Malcolm was referring to at that time was the racial disparities that existed then and that have only been highlighted and made even more glaringly apparent by this most recent pandemic in 2019 and then 2020. We know that the difference between disease risk and fatality for African Americans is drastically worse compared to our white counterparts. According to an article in the Journal for American Medical Association entitled COVID-19 and the African American Community, it was published on April the 15th, 2020. Here are some startling statistics about the current pandemic and African Americans. In Chicago, where the only percentage of the population for Black people is actually 30% for the citywide, but when this article was published, 50% of the COVID-19 cases and nearly 70% of deaths were concentrated in the African American community. In Louisiana, where Black people make up only 32% of the population, we accounted for more than 70.5% of deaths from COVID-19 at the time of the article publication. And in Michigan, where Black people only make up 14% of the population, Black people made up 33% of the COVID-19 cases and 40% of deaths. And similarly, in New York, where the epicenter of the COVID-19 virus took off in the United States, where Blacks and Latinos are only 22 and 29% of the population, respectively, we accounted for 28 and 34% of the deaths in New York at the time. So, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation and their EPIC Hospital Research Network, we found out that Black people and Hispanics, as well as Asians, were dying at disproportionate numbers compared to our white counterparts. Dr. Jamica, do you have the graphic for that?
Hispanic adults are deciding on whether to get the COVID vaccine. You say percent who say they will get the COVID-19 vaccine. You can see the dark blue is already gotten or as soon as possible. Light blue is wait and see. The lighter green is only if required, and then the other is definitely not. So Blacks make up 43% of those who say that they will wait and see about getting the COVID-19 vaccine. And you can also see 14% of them that say they will definitely not get the COVID-19 vaccine. So if you compare that number to Hispanics and whites, you'll see that number is very different.
Now,
so what do you say?
Go ahead.
Okay, so one of the things Dr. Danny mentioned was some of the statistics about different states and the COVID-19 vaccine versus hospitalizations and death. So what we know about Chicagoans is Black people account for nearly 40% of COVID-19 related deaths in Chicago, but they comprise less than a third of the population. And if you look overall at Illinois residents, 11% of them had gotten at least one dose of the 2-dose regimen. And the same was just true of only 5% of Black residents and 4% of Hispanic residents. Now, if you look at that for those people over age 65 of any race or ethnicity, 26.9% had gotten a first shot. And we're looking at Illinois, in ages 16 to 64, 8.8% had gotten a first shot. So you can see that the numbers are different based on race, ethnicity, and age.
That's right.
Some of the other things we wanted to talk about was some of the Illinois data as of February 12th, which was just last week when they look at the differences in the vaccines. You can see here, same thing with Hispanics, Blacks, whites, and others. Those who have gotten the first shot or are fully vaccinated, you can see really different numbers. So among the percentage of residents, so Blacks that have already gotten the first shot, 5%, and among African Americans that are fully vaccinated, only 1%. Compare that to white Americans that are fully vaccinated, which is 3% of white Americans are fully vaccinated. And out of the whites that have gotten the first shot, it's 11%. So that's like double what we see among African Americans. So one of the things Dr. Danny was just talking about was the differences in the states. So if you can see this, you can see the percent of vaccinations, percent of cases, percent of deaths, and percent of total population. So we're in St. Louis, right? So if you look at the Missouri line, you see Blacks account for 5% of Missouri COVID-19 vaccinations, but 12% of the cases, 4% of the deaths, and 5% of the population. So, oh, I'm sorry, I was at the wrong number. So 12% of cases, 14% of deaths, and 11% of total population. So at this rate, what we should be able to see is a number that is very similar based on our population and percentages of death. So in Missouri, we should be seeing like a 14% vaccination rate, and yet we're only seeing 5%. And you can also look at the other states here. Illinois is not on this one, but you can see other states that may be surrounding and look at the difference in the numbers. But this is United States data, and all I have.
So we know that the definition of, no, I was just saying, we know that the definition of a healthcare disparity is a difference in health outcomes based on basically race or ethnicity, but it's also a disproportionate difference in those outcomes attributable to factors other than access to care. And that can really be explained by the history of Black people and our treatment in the United States when it comes to healthcare. Most people agree that race is a sociological construct and that it was created in order to promote more economical means in this country. We're all aware that all men are created of the same genetic material. We share the same origin in Africa, and there really are no genetic differences between humans. And the only really differences are male and female, right? Differences in skin color can be explained as merely evolutionary, and it's a trait that most men and women adapted to adjust to their respective environments. So in Africa, we had more melanin because we needed protection from the sun. And in Siberia and places that were colder, where the sun was not as much of an element, you're pale in comparison. But in an article entitled Race, Medicine, and Healthcare in the United States, a historical survey, we know that race became the subject for formal and theoretical speculation and scientific investigation when Western imperialistic aspiration began. In other words, when we found that it was necessary to justify the means to mistreat other humans, to be able to justify why they were not going to be treated equally, or to become conquerors and enter their land without explanation. We then created this social construct, which now even pervaded medicine and medical institutions, and then eventually affects African slaves and their health. And when we look back through history, we begin to see that the same scientific and medical communities who were responsible for providing African-American slaves and Blacks their health care were the places where this is, beginning to be perpetuated, these racial stereotypes and things that actually end up affecting us because of bias. So in the Renaissance time, you see people who were responsible for doing things like naming animals, peoples, and objects, actually classifying darker skinned people, Blacks and Africans, as subhuman or lower in the human family ranking. In more modern times, you have people who wrote very popular medical textbooks like Robley Dungleson, who was considered the father of American physiology, and wrote a book that many medical schools followed for years called Human Physiology, who espoused that there were three racial types. There were Caucasians, Negroes, and Mongoloid. And according to him, Blacks were inferior, and we were considered Negro. And supposedly we held a place between between Caucasians and orangutans. Now, these very ethnocentric type theories were taught in medical schools, even to well-intentioned aspiring physicians who may not have had these biases or beliefs, but because of what they were taught was scientific knowledge, they then learned these racist and ethnic centric attitudes, and then perpetuated these beliefs into their treatment of Africans and slaves. You can see that it takes a step further because these actual theories and beliefs are then allowed to set up a system of treatment for healthcare that allowed for Black people and slaves to be stratified into a lesser treatment because we weren't considered human. It's well documented that at the beginning of colonial times in America, that Blacks and Africans actually had the worst health and the worst health outcomes. We could only receive health care if our slaves or owners deemed it necessary and profitable for us to get health care. And when we did get health care, it was in places that were of ill repute. We were looking for health care in places like pest houses, almshouses, houses of the unworthy poor is what they called it. And there was no standard of care. Black people were tortured and compared to their white counterparts who received care in private offices, doctors' homes or their own homes, or even private hospitals well into the early 19th century. Their experience was in stark contrast to ours, which was often something that was traumatizing and that has actually been built into the DNA of Black people to this day because of those bad experiences. We can see that this lack of regard for African Americans has carried well into the 21st century. And you can tell that, we were considered inferior and less than human because of the way that we were treated. Some very popular and well-known examples of this mistreatment, just to name a few, are Henrietta Lacks, which is one of the more famous cases that we're all aware of. A Black female who went into treatment for her cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins, which at the time was one of the few places Blacks and poor people could receive care. And when she had a biopsy taken of her cervix, and it was observed in the lab that her cells continued to grow, unlike some other people's cells, they then took and replicated these cells. And we know that that cell line continues to live on to this day. And the family was not even aware, nor was the patient aware or had given any permission for them cells. And so it wasn't until 25 years later, after she died, that the family found out about the use of her HeLa cells, which we all know are very famous in medicine and science. The family never was compensated for the use of her cell line, and they never received any compensation from the book or the movies that were written about her. More known to us all usually is the Tuskegee Experiment, which began in 1932 and lasted for more than 40 years, where it tested over 600 Black men in Alabama. And these men were simply observed while they went through advanced stages of developing syphilis, even after 15 years into the experiment, when it was known that penicillin could treat and cure this disease. And the long-term effect of that was that it was passed on to these men's wives, that several of the men had children who died at birth because it was passed on in utero. And it wasn't until after 1975, when they were taken to court, that these families were compensated. And it was several $1 million, but it definitely wasn't worth the lives that were damaged and harmed by the research and experiments that were done. And it wasn't until 1997, another 20 years later, that Bill Clinton even apologized for what was done to these families. And so you can see the trauma that can be built in because of things like this. Finally, we know in Mississippi, They had what was known as the Mississippi Appendectomy, where physicians would laughingly perform hysterectomies on Black women who were unaware and who did not give consent. And so they basically went about doing sterilization for the Black population because they were afraid of Black population growth and being outnumbered at the time. There's countless other examples of Black people being harmed in this country by scientific racism. So whether it's being paraded in front of medical school classes and being pointed out how certain features were subhuman, or experimenting on us without anesthesia or pain medicine, creating books of Negro diseases where that supposedly explained the inferiorities or differences in Black people and our sexuality as they saw it. We have reason, to understand why Black people have a fear of the scientific community and the medical community, and to wonder if they have our best interest at heart. So with that being said, I think this is a good way to kind of segue to Dr. Jamica, who talks about some of that trauma.
Thank you. So, I'm gonna skip around and come back to that one. Okay. Let's see if we can get this going. Okay. So, thinking back on some of the things Dr. Danny just spoke about, Henrietta Lacks, the Tuskegee Experiment, the Mississippi Appendectomy, we have a long history of really being mistreated by the government in this country regarding our health. So again, we have all the reason in the world to be suspicious of things. I want to even add a little bit more to what we know in some of these recent studies to talk about some of the more recent findings regarding race. So a study published in 2016 conducted amongst 222 white medical students and medical residents. The findings state that about half of the participants, half of those who have false beliefs about the biological differences between Black and white people, rated Black patients' pain as lower when compared to white patients for the same exact injuries. So this is what we're looking 5 years ago. This is as recent as 5 years ago. They found that these are medical students. So these are people training to become doctors who believe that Black people have less pain for the same injuries, which explains a lot of the time why you hear why individuals will go to the doctor and they'll need pain medication, but the doctor will give a Black patient 5 pills and may give a white patient 30 pills for the same exact injury. Some of the other studies looked at, a 2014 study showed that doctors were more likely to diagnose Black patients with psychotic disorders than with depression. So in other words, you're a Black person, you're depressed, you're showing signs of depression. You go in to see a psychologist or psychiatrist or any other physician, and instead of getting diagnosed with depression, you're going to be likely to be diagnosed with some psychotic disorder, such as schizophrenia. Looking at another study that's also recent, the doctors reported that they believed that white patients were being more medically cooperative than African-American ones. Other studies say that African-American patients are treated differently than white patients when it comes to cardiovascular procedures. There are also differences regarding cancer diagnosis and treatment, and also with HIV treatment. African-Americans were less likely to receive appropriate care when they were affected with HIV. All right, so some more studies looking at doctors' treatment of patients. Black patients are more likely to receive less desirable treatments. The rates at which Black patients have their limbs amputated is higher than those for white patients. And also Black patients suffering from bipolar disorder are more likely to be treated with antipsychotic medication, despite evidence that these medications have long-term and negative effects and are not effective. So you can see a long history from some of the things Dr. Dan talked about, all the way to some of the recent studies that give us all ample reason to be very suspicious and afraid of the intentions of the medical establishment as well as the government when it comes to African American healthcare and longevity. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Danny, because what we want to do today is make sure that you have a good understanding of what is true about the COVID-19 vaccine and what is not true.
Talked a little bit about the history. We brought it up to, you know, some of the things that are still preventing Black people and people of color from feeling confident in the medical system. But as far as the coronavirus and the myths that exist out there, what are some of those myths that have been started, which are making people leery to consider getting the vaccine? I've heard a number of wild theories. We're only going to talk about a few tonight. One of the more popular things that I've heard from patients in my office is that coronavirus was started to cover up the 5G expansion. The 5G network, which was, you know, this big rollout and expansion of our telecommunication network, could cause lots of side effects from all of the radio waves and things of that nature. And they wanted to do this as a distraction for what was really going on, which was the 5G network. Well, I'm not sure about that. We know the 5G network has been expanding. We know that's real. But what we do know is that coronavirus is real, and there's been no connection to any radioactive waves or anything of that nature. We know that coronavirus has actually been perpetrated by person-to-person transmission. Another one of the myths that we hear is that, well, if I don't have a temperature, then I don't have coronavirus. And that's not true. Coronavirus takes 1 to 14 days to incubate, and so you may be afebrile when you're tested, and at that time that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have it. It's just that it's not detectable at that point. And so what that means is if you know you've been exposed to coronavirus or people who have been tested positive, you need to be quarantining regardless of what the test showed. So not having a temperature does not mean that you do not have coronavirus, okay? Some of the other things that we've heard was that it was started in the lab in Wuhan. This was started by our conspirator in chief, Donald Trump, who said that this was the case, that it was actually started as a biological weapon in Wuhan. And we have found this week from the World Health Organization's entry into China and their exploration that they have not found any evidence of this actual virus in the labs there. In fact, they haven't even found a true reservoir in animals. And so while there is some similarity between the DNA that coronavirus or COVID-19 has between some viruses found in bats by 96.2%, the similarity is not enough that we believe that this is for sure the source of coronavirus. Another thing was, and this was because of, again, politicization of the virus and disease, was that, children can't get a severe form of coronavirus. While it's rare for them to have the more severe forms of coronavirus, children can and have gotten severe forms of coronavirus and died. So while it's usually the milder forms that children get, they can get severe forms of coronavirus. So we just want people to be aware of, how this misinformation is detrimental to our communities, because oftentimes what you're seeing in the research is that when you question African Americans compared to other ethnic groups about how this disease is transmitted, we still are not educated enough compared to our colleagues. And so that means there's a failure on the part of the public health system to adequately reach people or to educate them in a way that is able to be received and understood.
All right. So a couple other things we want to make sure that we cover regarding the myths and facts about the coronavirus. And these are just things that we've both heard as time has gone on. One of the things I hear a lot is, well, they talk about it on the news a lot about how African Americans are more likely to have hospitalizations and death from COVID-19 because of our pre-existing conditions, right? We've all talked about these pre-existing conditions. What are pre-existing conditions? Conditions that you have prior to getting COVID-19. So these would be things like high blood pressure, diabetes, any other lung disease like COPD, asthma. These will all be pre-existing conditions. So Dr. Danny is going to talk to you a little bit about why are those things so important. There is a reason why African Americans suffer more from COVID-19 than other demographics.
So we kind of alluded to that in a little bit of the background and history about Africans and our health status in this country having been basically the worst since the beginning, the inception of this country, not being able to receive health care, which led to us basically having illnesses that went for long periods of time untreated and us not seeking help because we were basically marginalized. And so because of that, that marginalization socioeconomically, economically, that led to Black people having higher proportions of those, common chronic health conditions, diabetes, hypertension, because of the lifestyle even that we had to lead to survive. We were likely to eat fat back and pork and things like that in order to be able to survive. And we know now that those foods that we ate during slavery in order to survive, which we love, are directly connected to things like obesity, things like hypertension, things like heart disease, which in the long run make us susceptible to coronavirus, because coronavirus thrives on people who have multiple comorbidities, and it makes it easier to attack the immune system. When you have, 2 or more health conditions, you're basically immunocompromised. It's an entryway, and what we know is that coronavirus actually causes inflammation throughout the body, and so it gives an opportunity, a portal to entry, and to attack the heart, to attack the kidneys, to attack the lungs, and even the brain. We've seen cases of kidney disease worsened when people have contracted coronavirus. We've seen people who have baseline asthma but succumb to severe respiratory issues and end up on the ventilator even at a young age. And so while Black people and the community kind of marvel at this, we are disproportionately affected by these chronic health conditions. And so that means that, again, we're target number one, just like we are most chronic health conditions and diseases, because of how we started our journey in this country.
And some of the data shows that in Chicago alone, 75% of older African Americans suffer from high blood pressure.
Exactly.
75%. That is a lot. That's 3 out of 4 older African Americans who suffer from high blood pressure, which means that this group in and of itself is at a much higher risk for some of the severities of COVID.
And what they've shown even was that it was 5 specific communities on the South Side, in particular in Chicago, that were affected by coronavirus in the outbreak in the beginning. Because why? Because those are the places, again, when you have, limited resources, you're living in communities where access to things like healthcare are limited, your income is limited, and so you're living in crowded living conditions. You can't social distance or live 6 feet or choose to take off when you have to go to work. You can't necessarily, choose that, your family member who's an essential worker and works in a grocery store might have to go in and be exposed, and then you come back to a home where there's limited room and there's several people living in small quarters. All of these things affect how the disease has been propagated through our communities.
Far as been like the history of mistreatment to African Americans by the government, by the medical establishment. So there are some things that are true and are real that are still happening today. For instance, if you're African American and you go see many white providers, you could be treated differently based on your appearance, based on your socioeconomic status, based on the amount of respect that they feel like you give or have given to their staff, based on the type of insurance you have. These are real issues that really can determine how you're treated by the medical establishment. So we totally get how why people don't trust the vaccine and why it's more of an issue for some versus others. But I also want to talk a little bit about some of the psychological factors that play into how people and why people feel the way they feel. So when I think about psychological factors that are affecting people's decision about whether to get the vaccine or not, a lot of it has to do with trauma. Some of the things that Dr. Danny has mentioned already about the Henrietta Lacks, the Tuskegee Experiment, some of the things that I mentioned about how we're treated in the medical establishment, that has caused for many African Americans a lot of trauma. In other words, we have memories of these other things that have happened to people. And for some of us, maybe large numbers of us, we actually know people, and if not ourselves, we know people that have been mistreated by the medical establishment, whether that means they've gone in to see a doctor and had an amputation that they shouldn't have had. Maybe they've gone in to see a doctor and gotten the wrong medication prescribed that they hadn't, or they've gone to see a doctor and something else has happened. We have trauma about the history to our group as a whole, but we also have trauma based on our individual factors and how the medical establishment has treated us in our communities. We also have anxiety. So one of the things that is created by years and generations of mistrust among the medical community and the Black community is anxiety. So we're concerned. So I work a great deal with older adult patients, and so does Dr. Danny. And one of the things that I hear with my patients a lot is the older ones, that they're afraid. They're actually very, very afraid to get sick and have to go into the hospital. They're afraid of what might happen to them while they're there. They're afraid of how they're treated. They're afraid that they'll go into the hospital and they won't come out. So for that reason alone, it makes them really put some distance and stay away from anything having to do with any doctors. So we have a lot of anxiety and fear in our communities that's keeping us from both getting accurate information about the vaccine and getting the help that we need as far as getting the vaccines that we need in our community. Because there are only so many options that we have as far as how we're going to come out of this at the end. And it's either staying away from people or it's getting the vaccine. And there are really not a lot of other options. So based on all the things that Dr. Danny and I have talked about, what we kind of want to focus on now is where do we go from here?
Right. I think it's easy for people to throw up our hands and say we should avoid the vaccine because we know the medical and scientific communities have targeted us in the past. So what makes now different, which a lot of people have said, why are they're pointing to the why are Black people and people of color dying in disproportionate numbers. And it's not anything new. It's just that it's highlighted in modern times and people have access to the information and now we're aware. And so what do? Do we, take the we're going to step out approach, or do we take the empowered approach and get the vaccine because we know in the past we may not have even been offered the vaccine? And we see others who, we know are, not mistreated in the medical community or health system, and they're anxious and eager to get it as well. And I say that this is, what we do. We step forward and we take the empowered approach. We say, we know for sure that we have to have a certain number of people to be vaccinated. People are saying, oh, I'll just wait till herd immunity is achieved. It has to be 70% of the population that is actually immune to this virus and has either received the vaccine or had the virus and been infected. And we still don't know if having the virus makes you immune to it because we're still learning about it. And so, you know, the sooner that we all kind of step into this, the sooner we can say, well, that's one less thing that may make me susceptible to succumbing to my chronic health conditions. That's one more thing that will allow me to kind of function and return to some normalcy, because we have people who have to and need to return to work. We have people that have to and need to provide for their family. And so if you do this, it's a thing of responsibility. I know you've gotten the vaccine, Dr. Jamica. I've gotten the vaccine. My symptoms have been mild. In fact, I just finished this past Saturday with my vaccine. I've had swelling and pain at the site, which is the most common reported side effect. 84% of people who get the vaccine, that's the most common reported side effect. My husband, the first time, had swelling and pain at the site. The second time, he was extremely sleepy for a couple of days. And after that, it got better. So not everybody is the same. We don't have any real underlying health conditions. But I think that it's worthwhile, especially when you do have multiple health conditions, to consider getting this vaccine.
Dr. Danny, do you know which one you had? Did you have Pfizer or Moderna?
We got the Pfizer vaccine.
So I got Moderna, and I got my shot 2 last week. And so I didn't have any symptoms with the first shot. With the second shot, I didn't have a sore arm this time, but I did have chills, body aches and chills for about 24 hours. And to put it in perspective, people consider those to be minor symptoms of COVID-19. To expect those because your body has to build up an immunity, right, against the virus. So it was minor, but it did not feel good to me. I will say that. Those chills, I felt like somebody had injected me with like bone cancer or something for about 24 hours. But then it went away, and it was like it was never there. So I would have rather had that than actually have the vaccine with some of the symptoms that people talk about. I mean, the virus with some of the symptoms that people talk about. Because as you've heard, if you watch the news here lately, you hear people who have suffered from COVID-19, and not all people, but some people are in the category of what they call the long haulers, right? The people who recover from the actual respiratory symptoms, but then they have these long-term effects of cognitive decline and memory and weakness. And these are people that may be in their 30s, 40s that end up having to go out on disability and are no longer able to work on their jobs because of this particular form of COVID-19. So it is really scary. Now they're talking about eye problems, so having vision difficulties later, months later after you recover from it. So there are a lot of things that will linger if you have a certain type of it, and depending on how your body reacts. So there's a lot of reasons why we should all want to prevent it.
Exactly. And that kind of goes back to what I talked about before. Well, one, the theory that, there's no long-term effect. I don't think I mentioned it, but it was on the slide, to having coronavirus, and that's just not true. We know that it's multi-inflammatory and affects multiple systems, and there are long-term effects to having coronavirus. So if you haven't had it, you definitely don't want to get it. And, knock on wood, thank God that, despite continuing to see patients and things over this past year during the pandemic, we've been blessed and haven't had it. But, for those who have, and even some of my younger healthy patients who got it, just the explanation of what they experience is gut-wrenching sometimes. And like you said, it's not something that's easily recovered from when you get it sometimes.
No, so some of my patients that have had it are still months later recovering from a sense of taste, sense of smell, fatigue, just this cognitive, they call it like this, like drag. It's like their brain is just not functioning like it should, and it's a little bit slower.
Mm-hmm.
These are young people, like I said, 30s and 40s that are still dealing with this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Doc, can you all hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Diva Docs, we appreciate this awesome information. And as I promised, I would take some questions from our virtual audience. This has been really rich. So here's the first question that we have. Are African Americans getting an inferior vaccine? And I just had this conversation. Someone asked this question, but I had this conversation earlier when someone wondered if the vaccine they're getting is actually just water for Black folks.
Wow. So
have you ever heard that?
I've not heard of that, but I'm not surprised. Again, Tuskegee Experiment, people getting placebo vaccines or placebo treatment for the syphilis. And so, what we do know is that after that was discovered and in 1970s, there were actually laws and legislations made to protect patients, to make sure that when they participate in things like clinical trials or they actually sign up to get a vaccine or receive medication, that they are actually getting what they believe that they are receiving. It's not ethical for people, and not that it doesn't mean that it couldn't happen, but it is not ethical to have people to come and to separate and give different vaccines for people. When you go to a vaccine administration site, most of the time these vaccines, because of the way that the COVID vaccine works and it has to be under strict temperature conditions, they have a specific amount of time in which they have to thaw this vaccine, and it has to be at that temperature for a limited amount of time, and it's effective, only for that time. And then after that, it's no good. There's really no room for people to do a lot of finagling with this vaccine. And so for that reason, I feel real confident that what you're getting or you expect to get, you should be receiving.
Okay. So we only have about 9 more minutes. I'm going to get in as many questions as we can. So next question I have is, once I have been vaccinated, can I get the virus again?
So this is something that we're still, finding out, right? So what we're finding out is there's different strains of the coronavirus. We're hoping that, what you get as far as the vaccine will be able to mount a systemic response and to address anything that you might encounter in real life. And so, the answer to that is we don't know, honestly. The hope is that you will be able to not get the coronavirus once you have this vaccine.
Okay.
But science is not exact. And I think that's what's hard for people to understand. It's just like with the flu virus. It changes every year or two with different strains come out and they have to tweak it, but we still continue to get the flu shot every year, knowing that it's still a chance we could get the flu.
Like the pneumonia is going to have to be every year like the flu. We're still finding out.
Okay. Well, one last question, and this is a reflection of another conversation I had earlier today. Who determines what area to get the vaccine? So there's some who feel that the Black community is not getting their fair share of the vaccine. Is there a plan? Who determines who gets it?
So this is determined by local health departments, public health departments, on basically what they are distributed and how they get it. But of course we know that it was initially essential healthcare workers and people who were going to be on the front lines who received it, and then as far as the areas to which the vaccine go, again, that's determined by your public health department and the infrastructure that they have set up in each individual state and community. And so it's kind of locally determined. We hadn't had a united national response until Biden came in, unfortunately. And so that's why you see, that one, our public health system is very weak, and two, that there's been no real coordinated effort. So I think that this pandemic has exposed some weaknesses and is going to force people to make a more united public health system in the United States. Awesome.
Well, I want to thank you all again. I do. I actually feel more comfortable having received some of this information, and we're going to have you guys back because we need to still have some more conversation about how do we still build more trust within the Black community, and how do I have conversations with my doctor. And so we're going to continue this conversation. And for those of you who are in our virtual audience, if you've enjoyed this, make sure you put it into the chat. And if you're visiting us, this is Victory Apostolic Church in Matson, Illinois. Victory Table Talk. We have podcasts that we broadcasted weekly. If you are interested, feel free to come to our Facebook page or our YouTube, and we hope that one day you'll actually come visit us live. I want to send out a shout out to Pastor Andrew D. Singleton, who let me take charge of the service for the day, so I appreciate that. He has had the virus. He has still stayed strong, and I haven't seen him ill from taking the shot. So I'm feeling comfortable that I'm going to do it as well. So before we go, I want to have just a few seconds of silence in honor of the 500,000 people who have died, and then we're going to end it in prayer. Let's look to the Lord. Lord, we thank you and we praise your holy name for being the great Father who loves us and cares for us and watches over our needs and all of our wants, God. Lord, you see the conditions that we are living in now, where we're concerned not only about a winter storm that is impacting us, but we are also concerned about a deadly virus that is ravaging our communities disproportionately from others, God. Lord, we pray, God, that you will bless us to face the facts, God, to not be afraid of the vaccine that you have probably given to us, and you have given doctors the knowledge, God, that we will go ahead and we will take the vaccine, Lord, that we will practice safe distancing, that we'll wear our masks, Lord, that we will walk wisely, God, and not walk in fear. We pray, Lord. Lord, I thank you for the doctors that are on this line. Pray that you'll protect and bless their households. We pray that you'll continue to bless this ministry of Victory Apostolic Church, God, and that your will be done, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, thank you all so much, and have a great night. I see Karina, so that must mean I'm off.